My name is Chun Hao. I'm one of the graduate co-chairs this year in Southeast Asia program. And welcome to the third Gatty lecture of fall 2025. Thank you for joining us on this another beautiful and sunny day. Now I'd like to invite Professor Magnus Fiskesel to do the honor of introducing our speaker for today, Professor Ian Baird from University of Wisconsin-Madison. Please.
Thank you. I'm very happy to have the honor to introduce Ian Baird as our speaker today. He's a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Wisconsin. His PhD is from British Columbia, University of British Columbia in geography. I feel, as an anthropologist, I feel a close kinship with geography, but and I think in anthropology we don't have enough of it. We need more geography, so that makes me extra happy to have a geographer here today. I believe last time he was here, he spoke to us about another of his several books, The Rise of the Brow, Ethnic Minorities in Northeastern Cambodia during Vietnamese occupation. That was several years ago. His newest book is entitled Champassak Royal Sovereignty Within and Between Nation States in Mainland Southeast Asia. And I believe we will hear more about that. We will hear more about that in his presentation today. He is a very prolific writer. He's published several other books, including one book in Lao about the fishes of Laos, which is interesting, and books and writings about fisheries. He's also been extremely prolific publisher of articles and book chapters. They cover topics such as indigeneity in Southeast Asia, especially ethnoecology, how people understand themselves as part of their environment. And connected to that, he's been writing about dams, hydropower, resettlement of people along the Mekong River, and so on. And also connected to that, about politics and land rights. Recently, he's published about indigenous peoples and electoral politics in Thailand and Cambodia, and how that's related to land rights. And he's also been writing about recent history and Cold War history in this region, including several recently published things, including one piece that just came out, The Enemy of My Enemy is My Friend, Transnational Ethnic Khmu Anti-Lao PRDR Insurgent during the late Cold War. And another one, which may be the newest, History Making, the Communist Party of Thailand's attempt to shape Hmong and Lua narratives, which I've briefly looked at. It looks absolutely fascinating. I've also noticed that our speaker has also published on North America. So he's very wide-ranging, and we're very happy to have you here and to hear about the new book. I had it out from the library, but I've returned it. So now everyone can go and look at the copy that we own in the library. And with that, I would like to welcome Ian Baird as our speaker today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Champassak royal family and their history, but I'm especially interested in engaging with the Champassak royal family, which I'll explain a little bit more moving forward, in relation to the concept of sovereignty. So sovereignty is really the theoretical framework and the concept which is more important for understanding this. But this is explaining a little bit about Champassak, because it's a place that a lot of people probably don't know or haven't heard of. But it's kind of a place in between countries. So if you look at this area here, including northeastern Cambodia, today is here and is located on the west side of the Mekong River in southern Laos, in Champassak province. But really, it's much beyond that. It's between different nation states. Let me talk a little bit about the idea of sovereignty, which is really the key theoretical framing that I'm using to think about this project. So sovereignty is often thought of as supreme power, especially over a body politic, a group of persons politically organized under a single government authority. However, this definition fails to sufficiently embrace more nuanced forms of sovereign power, which is really what I'm interested in engaging with here, not this sort of standard way of thinking, because I do feel like this rigid standard way of thinking about sovereignty doesn't really help us to explain what actually happens in these situations. Sometimes people also define sovereignty as freedom from external control or autonomy. And again, I feel like autonomy is is never really absolute. It doesn't exist in reality. It's an ideal form that is not realized in reality. Who has absolute autonomy ever, right? Who has not influenced by others? Who can control their own way and totally be without consideration of others? It's not absolute. So thinking about sovereignty maybe as a controlling influence is more useful. And really, sovereignty is all about varied forms of power, right? We're talking about power here in its various forms. That's what we're really talking about here. So my view of sovereignty really is that I see sovereignty as something fundamentally contingent and always in flux, thus requiring constant efforts, either explicit or more subtle, to construct, reinforce, and reproduce various fields of sovereignty. So sovereignty is always shifting. It can never be taken as a given. It always needs to be reinforced, recreated, reproduced in various ways. And that's what makes Champassak a great place to think about in terms of sovereignty, because over history, it's always had to do this. I would argue that all sovereign powers have to do it, but Champassak, is particularly clear because of its status, and I'll explain that as we move along. So basically, the thesis that I'm forwarding here is the notion that it is appropriate and useful to expand and nuance the ways we think about sovereignty, so that we conceptualize sovereignty as something that is much more contingent and variously asserted and practiced than has often previously been imagined. So we need to think of it in a more nuanced way to really understand how sovereignty works. So let's look at Champassak when it was first established in 1713. At that time, the borders of these what are now nation states did not exist. Champassak was created by a royal from Vientiane, and I won't go into all the details of how that split occurred, but it did. And Dao Soi Sisamut, or Jao Nakasat, established Champassak as the Kingdom of Champassak as a sovereign and autonomous royal kingdom in 1713. And there were various smaller states that were under its control. Early on, in many ways, it controlled much of what is now northeastern Thailand, all the way up, to what is now Korat, upwards to Khon Kaen. Much of northeastern Thailand was under the influence. I wouldn't say total control, but under the influence of Champassak. They were paying tribute to Champassak, etc. Down to southern Laos, over to Atapur, up to what is now Sawana Cape and near the border with Vietnam, and the Central Highlands. So that continued on to about 1778. In 1778, the government of Siam, or the military of Siam, took control and made Champassak into a vassal state of Siam. But before that, the sovereign power that existed under the first two kings of Champassak really were based on other forms of power, more than simply military or force. The Palladium of Champassak, or the Pageo Palut or Paung Khao, was seen as a powerful Buddhist religious symbol that justified, gave legitimacy to the Champassak royal family at that time. And there's a whole story about that, which you can read in the book, but I don't have time to get into it today. But basically, it was that was giving them legitimacy at that time. And it was seen that it was sort of a divine right for the king of Champassak to rule at that time. And essentially, I put this map not with a solid line, but because this is a very approximate boundary of Champassak at this time. But you can see there that this has the sort of present day borders, but not actually the present day, but this was in the time of Siam and Laos, and in a later period. You can sort of see where Champassak's influence was, and it was reduced at that time. See, after Siam became a vassal of Siam, its influence reduced. It no longer was controlling much of northeastern Thailand. It was still controlling some of northeastern Thailand, but a lesser area. Still had some areas as far as Kon Tum in Vietnam, northeastern Cambodia, what is now northeastern Cambodia, up until about Khmuan province in central or south central Laos. Now, the second chapter of my book looks at how what is arguably the last king of Champassak, and this is during that period after, between the time before the French moved in and then afterwards. That was Jao Kum Suk, and he was able to actually rebuild some of the power and sovereign power of Champassak under the Siamese. And he actually did that partially through gifting white elephants to the king of Siam, therefore gaining favor with Siam, which then was more willing to give him more free reign because he was seen as very loyal to Siam at that time. So white elephants were an important part of the effort to gain sovereign power. You gain influence, you gain through various means. And at that time, giving the king of Siam a white elephant was considered to be a very auspicious kind of thing that was much appreciated. And you were giving power to the king of Siam, which then in turn was giving you power as a kind of reciprocal relationship, right? So this is the way we need to think about these things, that sovereign power was ebbing and flowing in certain kinds of ways. And, these are all the small states that were giving tribute to Champassak during this period. And Jao Kum Suk was able to expand the number of tributary states, establish new ones that were then paying taxes, giving tribute to him. He was in turn giving tribute to Siam. But sovereign power was not absolute, but it was very important, and it was expanding at this time. Now, one of the ways in which sovereign power was also expanded in Champassak was to show the loyalty, apart from simply giving elephants. So these are two of the sons of Champassak, who were sent to Bangkok to live there with Thai royals as a way. They were seen partially as hostages in case Champassak was not loyal, but also as a way of demonstrating loyalty. And also Siam wanted to groom these royals to be loyal to Siam in the future by living there in Bangkok with the Thai royals as young men. And these two men will later play an important role in Thailand. I'll come back to them a little bit later. But this is in 1897. So this is before the French have already taken over part of southern Laos, but Champassak itself was on the west bank of the Mekong. So it was not yet part of French Laos. It was still part of Siam. But there was a lot of concern because they were so close to the French that the French might be gaining influence. And so as a way to demonstrate his loyalty, he sent two of his sons to stay in Bangkok. Because in reality, Champassak was talking to the French. He was under Siam as well. It was a complex situation. Sovereign power was not a given. It was a complex interaction of relationships. And at that time, this is Champassak here with some of the leaders of other parts of the Siamese kingdom, whether from southern Thailand, from Nan province, from other parts of what was under Siamese. And Champassak was one of the important sort of vassal states under Siam at that time. And there you have, this is Chulalongkorn in the middle there, King Chulalongkorn Rama V, right? As a sort of that they would every year they would go to Bangkok to show their loyalty. Now, as time went on, the borders shifted, and in 1905, Champassak was transferred to the French. The West Bank, the lower part of the West Bank, was transferred over to the French. But at this point, it's not there yet. This is before 1905, but I'll show you a map in a second that shows it later. And Champassak died slightly before this time, when it was still part of Siam. And this is his son. Some people call him a prince. They say he wasn't really a king because he didn't have the full authority. He was never elevated to that level. Because, of course, Champassak had been a king before the French had arrived, right? And so he was the transitional one. And this is his son. He still had a lot of influence, but not in the same way his father did. And he was also an opium addict, which may have affected his credibility. But locally in Champassak, he was still very influential. Chau Nui. And this is in Champassak, when they were still, even much later, really honoring these former kings. Now, I'll talk a little bit about Cambodia, northeastern Cambodia, and particularly Chau Tamatewa, or Ya Chau Tam, who was a Champassak royal as well, born in Champassak, and was sent by the Champassak family to stay in what is now Ratnakiri province and Stung Treng. And initially, this was still under the control of southern Laos. It was transferred to Cambodia in 1905. He was there before then. An amazing fellow. We don't have a picture of him. This is the top, or where his ashes are said to be. But he was the leader both under the Siamese Lao, or the Siamese Champassak. Then he was under the French. After that, the French Lao, And then he was under French Cambodia. And he was able to maintain his power, ebbed and flowed, and sometimes he lost it. He became governor 3 or 4 times, lost power, came back again, was able to influence things in various ways in order to maintain power. And a lot of the way he maintained his sovereign power was through magic. He had, this is a lu'om, so you put it in your mouth and it could make you disappear. So this, of course, gave him a lot. I mean, they said, so they say. This is from his relatives in France. They used this to make others fearful of him, to express his power. Power came through magic. These are what they call lukla, which are mummified fetuses that were also said to give magical powers to whoever had them. And he had one of these. This is his descendant had 2 of them. This is also from France. I took these photos in France, and they believe that these mummified fetuses, if you hold them, will give you great power. And this small elephant thing was also like a very important source of power. You know, they believed that they had these sort of things that would give them magical powers. They could disappear. They could, you know, move long distances in very short periods. You know, they could travel in another plane. I mean, these kinds of things. So sovereign power can also come from people's beliefs and demonstrating in different ways that you have power. And during this period, sovereign power was understood in a different way than it was now. This is an old ethnic brow man who I met years ago. He's passed away now. But the most memorable thing that he told me was, he says, I remember when my village was like a country. In other words, there was a time in the early 20th century in northeastern Cambodia where villages were fairly close to autonomous. They made their own decisions. They weren't really under any government control or minimal control, and had a huge number of. And so Yajou Kam was able to gradually pull some of these ethnic groups into his realm for the French, for the Cambodian state, for the Lao. And this is what gave him power, was his ability to get these sovereign villages to recognize the broader sovereign power. So sovereignty or sovereign power came from this relationship between Champassak royals and ethnic minorities who lived in remote areas. When probably one of the weakest points for Champassak in terms of sovereign power in Laos proper was during the French colonial period. The French colonials did not recognize Champassak as the legitimate royal family of Laos. They recognized only Luang Prabang as a unifying force for Laos. However, Champassak continued to have a great deal of influence in the southern part of Laos, but much less in northeastern Thailand, much less in southern Laos, northeastern Cambodia. So their territory being shrunk and was not officially recognized and was more locally recognized only in the south of Laos. But they didn't lose all their power, but they certainly didn't have the power that they had had previously. And the borders again had shifted. At this point, the French Lao had taken over Champassak proper, and the border had moved from the Mekong River out to here. And these other areas that were previously under their control were not really under their control anymore to the same extent. They still had some control there too, and I'll come back to that later, but it was, it was shifted, right? It was shifted. And this is an important figure in this period, Anyat Lun Singh, who was also from the Champassak royal family. But the way he gained power was they sent him away to study in France. He learned how to speak French. Zhao Nui, who was the head of the royal family, he could not go to study in France like some of the Luang Prabang royals did, because his younger brothers had already gone to Thailand or to Siam. And there was a fear that if he went, there'd be nobody to look after southern Laos. So he couldn't go. So he never really learned French. But Anyalwin Singh went instead. He came back, became a very important French government official in southern Laos. And that gave the family influence through him. And so knowing French was an important way in which sovereignty was sort of, collected, and how power was able to be exerted through him being an important French colonial official. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Champassaks in Thailand. So these are the two brothers that were sent in 1897. Later on, one of the brothers, Champassak, studied French in Saigon, in Vietnam, but then decided not to stay with the French and went to Thailand, or with Siam, and became an important government official there. He didn't like the French, either did his brother. They were both senior government officials in northern Thailand, Lampang, Chiang Mai, Chiang Rai, where they were able to use their royal connections. They were recognized by the Thai royals as loyal to Siam because they left from the French. And so they were rewarded for that. And they were able to exert a certain degree of sovereign power through the Siamese state. Eventually, Champassak did come back to Laos, but only after the French left in 1954. And he died in southern Laos. But they were able to, and there were other Champassak royals who also had fled in 1905 when Champassak became part of French Laos. They did not want to live under the French. They went to Siam, expressed their loyalty to Siam, and they were rewarded for that with senior government positions within Siam. So they were able to continue their royal power in a certain way within Thailand. They were like very influential, powerful people in Thailand, even though they were not official royals. But they did gain their power through being royals from Laos who were recognized as loyal to Siam. And there was a lot of visits. So this is a photograph of Chao Nui, who was in French Laos, visiting Ubon Ratchathani, where many of his relatives who had fled from French Laos were living. And so they maintained these relationships with the different relatives. And in Ubon, in particular, the Champassak royal family had a lot of sway. And they were able to live outside of certain laws. They had that kind of power. They could do things that normal people couldn't do. They could trade. They could do border trade in a way that other people could not. They were able to have access to Thai government officials in a way that others were not able to have access. This is another picture of them. So, and this Chao Silat in particular, I'll come back to him. He played a very important role during World War II. So, and this is Jahun Ying Sangwan Kam, which was the sister of Chao Nui, was one of the most powerful women. Because, Lao society is a matrilineal society. Women had a very important role to play. Often they would orchestrate marriages between relatives as a way to maintain a bloodline and to maintain a kind of sovereign power within their family. Because under the title system, if you're a Zhao and then you marry a commoner, then if a girl is born and then she marries outside of the royalty, then her rank goes down. So in order to refresh the ranks, you have to marry back into the family in order to keep those ranks more current. So this was an important strategy that they used also to maintain their influence and power. Now, Zhao Xilap, and this is his son, Zhao Champassak, who was an important source of a lot of my information about him. He led Siam, or Thailand, during the Second World War. The French were weakened. In 1941, they went into Champassak and took it over and gave it back to Thailand. So Champassak came back to Thailand for a brief 5-year period between, the early 1940-41 up until 1945. After the Second World War ended, they had to return it to the French. But for this period, he went in there, took it over. And so then, of course, they put Champassak royals back in charge there because they were the ones that had been loyal to Siam or Thailand previously, were able to take control again. And so again, you can see where sovereign power is shifting depending on geopolitical circumstances at that time and the ability to connect with certain powerful people and work on their behalf to show your loyalty. But of course, after 1945, that would change. Champassak himself was born in Thailand. Later, he lived in Laos. When he was born as a child, he could not use the word Jiao. He could not call himself a Jiao officially because he's from the Champassak royal family. The Jiao was only supposed to be used for the Thai official royal family. But when I met him in the 2010s, he was living in Ubon Ratchathani. He'd actually lived in the United States for many years, gone back to Thailand near the end of his life. And he had business cards in which he was writing Jiao on it, and he was handing them out to everyone. And he was, and one of the things about the Na Champassak name, and I'll come back to this later, is it's a registered name in Thailand. Na Champassak, or all the Nas, are names that you cannot use these names in Thailand without permission of other members of the family. But they have to be members who were born in Thailand. So there's a number of Na Champassaks in Thailand who were born in Laos, but they don't have legitimate. But he's one of the very few. He was one of the very few. He's dead now, but he's one of the very few who was born in Thailand, and that gave him power over the last name. In fact, he was the last one with that last name, and I'll get back to that near the end. And he controlled that name, and he used it as a way to extend his own sovereign power in Thailand, in a certain kind of a way. So again, we're back here now. Champassak's back in Siam for a short period, or back in Thailand for a short period. And things are, the Champassak royal families rising up again, having more power there because of their loyalty to Thailand. And that helped them out for some years. But eventually that was taken back again by the French. And then we're back into but then not long after that, the French had to leave Laos in 1954. And the period that followed 1954, the early independence period, depending on how you view independence, occurred after that. And Zhao Ngui's son was Zhao Bun And Zhao Bun under the sort of royal Lao government that came after 1954, was able to advance Champassak's power tremendously. The Luang Prabang royal family was still the official royal family, but he was number 3. He was considered number 3 after the Uparat, and then he was the number 3 within that family line within Laos. And he had a huge amount of control in southern Laos, a huge amount of popularity. And he'd also been loyal to France before that time, and had actually fought with the French against the Japanese. So he had a lot of credit with the French as well. But most importantly, he was kind of a country boy. He was never expected to be the head of the family. There was another royal who was older than him, who was in Champassak itself. They expected him to succeed his father, but he died in Saigon due to illness at a young age. And Jalbagum actually was the wife of a minor wife, the son of a minor wife, who was in a more remote place called Dontalat, outside of Champassak. And he grew up, riding around on village elephants and hunting and fishing with other village kids, and was really a country boy. He didn't really enjoy the pomp and circumstance of royalty. But this made him very popular amongst the common people because he was like them. He was just a villager, basically. But at the very last moment, when his father passed away in 1946, just after it had been returned to France, he was elevated as the head of the family. And so he could speak French well. He'd studied in Saigon. He had helped the French out, so he had credit with them. He had credit with village people because of the way he could operate like a villager. Even as head of the royal family, he would go to villages and go out fishing with them in the fishing pond or do stuff that other villagers did. That was the thing he liked to do. He often commented that the only people he really cared about were the villagers. And he was a great threat to the communist Pathet Lao, who tried very hard to make him look bad because he was a real threat to them, because he was kind of the people's king. As opposed to that, the Luang Prabang king hardly got out, didn't go out to see people much, was not revered as much by local people. And the king of Luang Prabang hardly came to the south at all. And even Vientiane Shan had very little influence over the south, which annoyed the prime minister, Suvarnabhuma, immensely, because he felt that he was the prime minister of the country, but when he went to the south, people didn't take him seriously. And Jalbagum was able to appoint military leaders in the south. All the main battalions were appointed by him. They were all people that he favored. He was almost operating a state within a state, in the south. And, this is him releasing a dove. He was, would participate in all the local rituals, all the Buddhist practices to gain merit. And they were, performing royalty. This is 1960, the wedding of Jao Sit, which is a half-brother of Jao Bun Um, and Jao Hui Jit Pasong, who is a half-sister of Jao Bun Um. They were, very close when but they married using this kind of elephants and ritual practices to perform royalty, which was an important way also to gain sovereign power. Right? You perform your royalty, you demonstrate to people who you are, you create an image of yourself, which leads to increased power. There's Jao Bun Um's brother, doing ceremonies at the Basi during the wedding. And that's the bride and the groom. The bride just died a couple years ago. She was the head of the Champassak royal family in France. She's just passed away recently. And her husband was sort of the head before that. He passed away some years earlier in the late 1990s. And, they also did a lot of Buddhist practices as well as a way to kind of gain merit, to also demonstrate their Buddhist, how much, Buddhist merit, because being royal is about having a lot of merit. That's why you are a royal, because you have merit from past lives. And they were going to reinforce that for future lives. And this performance is also an important way in which sovereignty was reproduced. But Jao Bun Um maybe made a little bit of a mistake. One of the things you could call it a mistake or not. He wanted his kids to be well educated abroad. So he sent all of his kids to France and to England for their education. Now, on the one hand, they all became educated. Some of them became doctors. Some of them, had very good positions. But a lot of them, like when they came back to Laos and visited, they couldn't speak Lao very well anymore. They didn't know the rituals. They couldn't connect with the people in the way. They were more French than they were Lao. And I think he didn't anticipate that they would, he thought, they're my children. They'll always be Lao. And they were in certain ways, but in other ways, they became very French. And that was a difficulty for him later on. He also had to spend a lot of money to support them to study in France. And he had to have income to do that. And this was maybe one of his main downfalls because he had to generate a lot of income. He also wanted to build houses. He wanted to show his royal power. So this is one of his houses in Don Talat, which is uncompleted. And the really one he wanted to build was in Paksay. This is in the 1970s. He was never completed before 1975. Now it's turned into a hotel. But the Lao government in Vientiane would not support his royal power. So he had to do all kinds of businesses to make money. And this actually caused him to lose some credibility because he was involved in casinos, he was involved in gambling, he was using his royal sovereign power to do border trade without having to pay taxes, and he was doing things that were somewhat unethical. And his wife, who was handling most of the business, because Zhao Bunun was a country boy, he wasn't really a businessman. She was doing most of the business for him. And she was using the sovereign power of her husband in ways that were often not very ethical. Even taking away land from people, and this hurt the reputation of the family in a very serious way and eroded some of their sovereign power or respect from the common people. And often Zhao Bunun didn't know. I mean, Zhao Bunun would go around. He wouldn't even have money in his pocket. If he wanted to give some money to a villager, he'd ask somebody with him, "Well, do you have any money? I want to give this guy some money." He never had any money. He didn't. He was just like a villager guy. He didn't really know about that stuff. But she was more astute because most of the business in Laos is done by women. Honestly, they're the powerful business people, and so she was the one that was really handling things. But he would visit stuff. This is him visiting. They were doing, panning in Cameroon province for metals. And he would visit these things. He had a French guy working for him, sitting beside him there. And then they were, also doing other things. They created an airline. They got involved in various kinds of businesses. And then they even used the Champassak insignia, but they put wings on it because it was part of the airline. This is the insignia for the airline, Lao Airlines, it was called, And so they were using their power also for business purposes, which didn't hold well with a lot of people. Finally, Zhao Bunun's brother, Zhao Bun-om, who was also a minister in the government and had a very powerful position, very powerful position. He was killed in 1975 in a bombing. A grenade was thrown into his Jeep in Vientiane. And that was part of a feud between the right wing of Laos. It wasn't really, they blamed it on the communists, but it probably wasn't the communists, it was others. And this there was a lot of instability at this time, a lot of division within the family. The younger generation were unhappy with all the businesses. They could see their reputation eroding. The Pathet Lao were gaining power and influence in the rural areas. And this was, the beginning this was near the end of their power within Laos. And finally in 1970, Zhao Sisuk was another important Champassak. He was Minister of Defense up until 75. He fled in 1975 from Laos. But he actually married a Luang Prabang. Well, this is his wife. Originally, he married a French woman, which was very much frowned upon. Later, he divorced her and married a Luang Prabang royal. But he was never seen as really at the core of the Southern Lao Champassaks because he married the Luang Prabang royal. And then finally, the Pathet Lao came in 1975 and, took over the country in a kind of bloodless coup after they had a peace agreement in 1973 that was supposed to lead to a coalition government. But the Pathet Lao violated that and took control in 75. They had a big statue of Zhao Yunti Tamaton the last king, and they removed it. They were originally going to take the statue and throw it into the Mekong River, but they were afraid of magic maybe hurting them, so they put it into a temple instead, hid it away. Still there, in the temple, in the Champassak temple. But the power was eroded, and many people were in refugee camps. So these are some of the refugee camps in Ubon Ratchathani. Many of them had come from Champassak. Those who were on the Royal Lao government side had fled. And then they developed a kind of what I call aleatory sovereignty, which can be defined as the constant making and remaking of shifting landscapes of unpredictable power with which both the governed and the governing must contend. And these were the insurgents that were developed by the Champassak royal family to fight against the communist government of Laos after 1975. And this is their military force. They had, hundreds or even thousands of supporters and soldiers under their control, were going inside of Laos to fight against the government. This is a kind of unknown story. The war didn't end in 1975. It continued, but this has been very poorly documented. But I've been working on this for quite a long time now. So this is family there. These are some of the insurgents. They were getting support from France, from relatives in France. They were involved in businesses to generate money to support themselves. They also got support from other right-wing leaders around the world, small amounts, some from the US, from Lao Americans as well. And this is Jalpang Gale, who still lives in Ubon Ratchathani, and he was one of the leaders. And he was one of the Champassak royals who was leading up this fight to regain sovereignty. And so they had a lot of power along the border on the Thai side and part of the Lao side as well. So it's not like their sovereign power just ended, but it ended at the center, in the capital cities, it ended, but on the borders, it was still very much in flux. This continued on up until 1989, when the Thai government came up with the battlefield to marketplace strategy. Many of them went to France at that point because they couldn't continue on. This is some of them. These the Champassak soldiers. They even had women with arms. This with their M16s, automatic weapons that they were using at that time. This is in the early 1980s. And they were also doing things like looking for, this is Jao Sak, a very important Champassak royal. He's at Ubon Ratchathani, and they were looking to try to find the remains of Americans that were missing from the war. And we're using this to try to gain support from the US and from Thailand. So this is him actually talking to journalists, showing them where in Laos these, and maybe there's even like live missing soldiers that are still imprisoned in Laos, and trying to use this to gain more power and influence at that time. And they kind of had a state within a state. They set up their own schools. These are the children of the insurgents. They had to put them in school. These are schools that they taught. These are in Thailand, but they taught Lao only. They didn't teach Thai. They taught Lao, and they called equal bamboo, the bamboo schools. And this is Zhao Rinjit Song, the wife of Zhao Sit, the Champassak royal, visiting the schools and handing out things to these children. And again, this is reinforcing this royal power, this royal sovereignty, right? You're giving things. You're the patron of these schools and these children, and keeping the children educated and being the patron was critical to keeping their fathers fighting for them in the battlefield. You had to look after the families too, right? So this was an important part of their strategy. Finally, most recently, you have these two women and others. They're not Champassak royals at all. They live in Thailand, but they've taken on the Nat Champassak name to try to gain influence. They both sell silk products. and they can claim that they have this genuine Lao silk, and they call themselves Nat Champassak, even though it's somewhat legal. It's not their legal names, but they've done this again because these royal ideas still have some currency within Thailand. They can still use this influence, this name, as a way to generate power. But the name really was under the control of Champassak. It was 1917 where the name Nat Champassak was created. Previously, that didn't exist. It was not created in Laos, it was created in Thailand. And this name was really important. So Champassak used this. So when Raymond Pierre Don Nat Champassak married Barbara Hunt, she would not marry him unless he had the last name. And the last name was granted by Champassak because he had control over the name, because it had been granted to him by the Thai king, even though they were in Laos. And then most recently, Champassak, who was the last one born in Thailand that had this last name, was using this last name up until just a few years ago to broker and gain money from other people that wanted to use the name. Basically selling the rights to the name because he was the only one who could authorize it. He was living in Thailand, but people that wanted this name, you could pay him some money and he could potentially get the name. So he had a certain kind of sovereign power. I mean, I would say this is a minor form of sovereign power, but it's a type of power that's linked to royalty and the rights over a name that nobody else has. So this is a guy who was taking him around, hoping to get the last name from him, carrying him around. He wouldn't give it to him in the end. Never got from him because he wanted money. This guy wasn't going to pay him, but he was trying to be nice to him because he's a relative. He just didn't have the last name. He lives in Sisiket. So what I've tried to show here is that there's many different ways in which sovereign power was produced, reproduced, created through all kinds of different forms. Much more nuanced than what we typically think about when we think about sovereign. Used in the past. I'll leave it for questions. I'm sorry it's been a little bit longer than I hoped to present, but there's a lot to say. So I'd be happy to hear your questions.
This presentation. I was listening to your interpretation and I was surprised to see that you think you were the grand president. But do you think that Nat Champassak at some point had an ambition to become a new head of government of all Laos when he was siding with North Savannah and CIA? And I'm talking specifically about...
You're talking about Jao Bun.
Yes.
Okay. Because many people had Nat Champassak last name. But Jao Bun, there was a period after World War II. And you're right, I didn't talk about it. It is in the book, though, where he had really envisioned recreating Champassak because the French were weak. There was a possibility of potentially reuniting the territories of northeastern Cambodia. He sent some of his family members down to create instability in northeastern Cambodia. He had relations in northeastern Thailand that he also hoped to utilize. He had this idea at a certain point that he could recreate the Champassak kingdom again, create a nation state. It could have happened, but at a certain point he realized that he couldn't do it, and then he decided to go another path and try to create more power within independent Laos. So it's an important. He had aspirations like that, absolutely, but he was a smart guy. And he knew that if he put all his all his chips in the same, all his marbles in the same basket, that it could potentially be disastrous for him and he could lose a lot of the power that he had already. And so he decided, he made an estimation and decided to go a different route. But it could have happened if political circumstances in Thailand had been a bit different, northeastern Cambodia had been a bit different, and southern Laos had been a bit different. He was definitely thinking about that. And he threatened it many times. I talk about it in the book a lot. He would often threaten separatism in southern Laos. And he would even tell the American ambassador, that he was losing confidence in the government there, and mentioned that there were people in the South that wanted to separate. He didn't say he himself. He said, although those in the South would like, he's talking about himself, really. So yes, it's a very good point. I really can't cover everything in the book there, but thank you for asking that question, because I probably should have said a little bit more about that. Yeah.
I'm interested in the relationship between sovereignty of authority, the concept of authority, and how that relates to these two other concepts as well. And I'm curious, are there analogous conceptions in Lao or Thai that are used to describe these things, or are these our concepts, or our words for something else?
Yeah, I think most of it, they have terms, but those are mostly adopted from Western concepts for the most part. They have their own ideas for sure. But I would say that the other thing that comes a lot through Western thought is the idea of territory.
Yeah.
So territory is often linked to the idea of, geographers often link that to sovereignty and territory. One of the things I'm also trying to do is decouple those. I don't think sovereignty is only linked to territory. And even most of the major geography thinkers on this topic would also agree that people like kings without a kingdom, right? Even in France, the Champassak royal family still has power in a certain way. But they still have titles, and they still allow titles for other people. But they don't, it's not official. So it depends more on who still believes in them. It's within the Lao community in France, right? Not outside of it, right? So there are certainly terms, there's titles, there are designations that are their own that help to reassert this sovereign power in certain ways. But they're not analogous to the terms that we use, but they also do use those terms as well, because terms related to nation states emerged after, and they were part of those. So they're not devoid of those ideas either, right? And there are still some in Laos who say, well, how can the king of Laos, or how can the royal family in France have any authority, because they don't have any territory, right? The territory, a lot of them, if you don't have territory, but I would argue that they do have a certain degree of authority. Having territory is important, though. It's not that it's not important, but it doesn't mean that when you lose territory that you necessarily lose all your power. You just have less of it, or it's a different kind of power. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
So my impression from some historical accounts of Thailand's modernization in the late 19th century is that Thailand colonized itself in some ways, especially with peripheries like Chiang Mai and Pattani, adopting some European bureaucratic forms. And I'm curious for the bits of Champassak that were in northeastern Thailand, did it adopt a similar approach to that area as it did to Chiang Mai and Pattani, or was it different? And did this royal family play any part in that process?
Yeah. So the answer is yes. These as a way to protect themselves from being colonized by Europeans, King Chulalongkorn adopted some European ways of doing things in order to make himself acceptable to the European powers, and therefore avoid a justification that Thailand was too primitive and needed to be advanced, and it could only be advanced through colonial power, right? And that covered everywhere, right? But on the peripheries, of course, it was a little bit. It was overlapping with other forms of power, like Champassak power as well. So none of these forms were complete, right? None of them were absolute, right? They were combined with previous forms of power, and they came out in different ways. It's kind of like identities, right? Identities can come out in different ways depending on who you're talking to and who you're having to deal with. So if you're dealing with local people, you might evoke the Champassak royal veneer, right? If you're dealing with national powers from other countries, you would be creating a more kind of unified national vision, right? So, if you're in the media, right, if you're in newspapers, you might present things in certain ways. When you're at local rituals in a Buddhist temple, you're presenting things in another way. So it's varied, right? And depending on place, and yeah, it's very complicated. But yes, basically it was the same sort of thing. I would argue it was the same in Lanna in the north of Thailand, other parts of Thailand, the same sort of thing was happening. Yeah.
Here with this ongoing issue that continues today in the south of Thailand at the Malaysian border, with the schools and this conflict over do we teach in Malay or in Thai, was there similar conflict with these schools that were set up to teach in the Lao language, or what was the Thai government's position on?
So the Thai government didn't oppose these because they were people that came from Laos. They were refugees who were going to these schools. They were not Thai citizens. If Thai citizens had been studying in Laos, they would never have allowed it. But this was seen as, these are Lao refugees. They're going to go back to Laos. They're not Thais. They're just taking refuge with us. And we have this force, which is in case the communists try to invade us, because there was a big concern of the domino effect, right? That the communists would take over Thailand. So having this force was helpful to the Thais. It was helping their security situation. And we have to keep those soldiers happy in order to fight for us, because they didn't want an all-out war with Laos. So they were using these as kind of proxies, which the Lao soldiers had their own view, and the Thais did not align with what the Thais often wanted them to do. So this was another point of conflict. But basically having those schools was for refugees. And so that was allowed. But I'll tell you, if they had set up a school like this and there were people from northeastern Thailand who were Thai citizens attending, it would have been a real big problem, and they would never have allowed it. Yeah.
I'd love to hear about where the register of audience might fit into your analysis.
The what?
The register of audience.
The register of audience. What do you mean by that?
Elements of sovereign power need a pedagogy to be understood.
Yeah.
Like our Champassak royalty doing these rituals or exchanges of objects of sovereign power or ritual performance into a void with an understanding they will be automatically received and understood, or does sovereign power, the performance of sovereign power, need a certain kind of preconditioning or pedagogy in order to be?
Well, it certainly does, need certain preconditions and certain understanding. So, for example, Jalbagum would often have these rituals at the boat races. Every year in November, there'd be a major boat race, and they'd bring down the ethnic minorities, and he would drink, rice wine, rice beer with them. He would exchange gifts with them. He would replicate some of this former tribute relationship, even though he was not the head of the state, right? But by performing that, he was creating a lot of influence at a local level. And this was based on previous understandings and previous things that had occurred, by his ancestors previously, right? So if those things had not occurred previously, it would, they would have been much harder to justify them in that moment. And interestingly, after 1975, they banned all this, right? Because they realized that this was the source of power in some ways for Champassaks, was these rituals, activities. So they weren't allowing any of them. But interestingly, some of them have begun to emerge. Jalbagum's daughter actually moved back to Champassak a few years ago. If it had been a son, they might not have allowed it. But as a daughter, they were a little more willing. And she's married to a French guy, which helped a bit. But they started to invite her to rituals. And she was brought up in French. She speaks Lao, but she doesn't really know the rituals, but they were teaching her. And they were beginning to accept her in that ritual space. And she was being careful not to overextend her authority to an extent that might upset them. But in a way, they wanted it back, but they were also wary. Right? It's a kind of a given, like they want a certain legitimacy, because the Lao government recently has elevated some of the former kings of Laos, not the Champassak kings, but some of the Luang Prabang kings. Zhao Annuwong, they have a big statue of him because he's seen as, controlling northeastern Thailand. They got a statue of him pointing to the northeast of Thailand. This is part of, this is a very provocative statement about their view that northeastern Thailand should be part of Laos, right? And so they've elevated certain royal figures, but not recent ones that are farther back where they don't have to contend with recent politics. So it's very selective, it's very purposeful, but they're trying to create a history that will justify, that they can use as a basis for their own sovereign power. Yeah.
Talk about sovereignty, and I was thinking that if you compare, Siam and Laos back then, right? The Lao sovereignty is really dispersed, right? When you think about sovereignty for a state, in Siam was easy because you have absolute monarchy, so sovereignty, flows from the top, meaning the king, down to his children, and so on and so forth. So when you mention Cha Bun-um's mistake about sending his children to France and coming back and being alienated, is because they probably lacked a central authority. Because if you also mentioned King Chulalongkorn, right?
Yeah.
Who also sent his children to Europe, mostly to England, to come back as a strategy for anti-colonialism. So,
no, you're right.
What's the difference between the two then? Because Cha Bun-um does not really have sovereignty as an absolute.
Right.
So the state is very important.
Well, I would say that he had a certain degree of sovereignty. I would also argue that Thailand did not have absolute sovereignty. I don't think they use this term absolute sovereignty as if the Thai kings had absolute power. But the reality is that even the absolute powerful kings of Siam were also having to negotiate with different regions and with local leaders. And they were, it was a negotiated power relationship as well. They use this term absolute, but I think that it's much more nuanced. Do you think that Chulalongkorn had full absolute power over the deep south of Thailand? I don't think so. He had a degree of power, a high level of degree. So I'm just saying that, but in terms of your broader question, could elevate them to the same level as Europeans, and it was a strategy against European colonialism. So I agree that was, both of them were thinking in a similar way in that regard. But I think that what he didn't understand is that they would lose a certain level of legitimacy amongst their own people by not knowing the rituals and not knowing the language when they came back. I think that's where he was thinking more about their legitimacy in relation to Europeans and less about their legitimacy within their own people. And the difference, of course, is that within Thailand, they had this more official kind of structure that was more that they could use as a way to make sure that they would not lose legitimacy amongst their people. So there are some similarities, some differences, and I don't think there are definitely some similarities in their thinking, but also there were some differences. They also sent members of the Champassak royal family to study within the Thai royal palace as a way to gain legitimacy within Thailand, right? So again, this is a complex situation. And I think that we've used these terms absolute power, absolute sovereignty for kings, or constitutional sovereignty. I mean, do you think the king of Thailand now is only a constitutional monarchy, or does he have power beyond that? Some people would say yes. It's a complex situation, right? That is difficult to just, that's what we need to nuance our thinking about this. Yes.
For your presentation, I really like how you actually trace like the ebb and flow of like the meaning of sovereignty in relation to power. I'm just curious, in what circumstances when sovereignty ends? Like when does it end? Like, is that a limitation to like reaching?
Well, yeah, when does it end? I mean, that's a good question. It's hard to put your finger on it, right? Because one could say that the most recent period in France or in Thailand, it's barely at the low point, in the sense that All they have is the name, some rituals. They don't have official recognition. In France, they're not recognized as even an exile royal family or anything like that. And yet, I've spent months with them in France, and I've seen them exert that amongst the Lao community in France, where they are given great respect by other members of the community, but not necessarily the younger members. And it's going away. It's gradually, but it doesn't. It's not just like what moment will we say it's gone? I guess that's still to be seen. It's not quite gone yet, but it's certainly less. Maybe it could be elevated again at a certain point if the politics in Laos change. That could happen potentially. That's what happened in Cambodia, right? The king came back. They're still hoping that might happen, but maybe it won't. And so, what point does sovereignty disappear? Well, what point does power disappear? Like, you could ask the same question, and it's hard to say. Yeah. Okay, are we?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Professor Baird for this very wonderful lecture. And next week we'll have another lecture, same time, same location, on deities of diet and design, Hindu gods, and the aestheticization of Thai American restaurant art, from our own postdoctoral fellow Dita Padajati. And you're welcome to come too.